Hi, I'm Nadra Nittle, education reporter at the 19th. We're now talking about labor and tech. We're joined by Amanda Ballantyne, executive director of the AFL-CIO's Technology Institute. Thanks for making the time, Amanda.
Thanks, Nadra. Thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. You were named the first director of the Technology Institute in 2021, and I was wondering if you could tell me what the Technology Institute does and how does it use tech and innovation to advance the labor movement?
Sure. And again, thanks for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on your show. The AFL-CIO, first of all, to let you know, the AFL-CIO is a federation of 60 international labor unions that really cover every sector of the U.S. economy, from entertainment and sports to manufacturing to education. The AFL-CIO Technology Institute is a new project that we launched about 2 years ago now, and the focus of it is to really understand the impacts of emerging technologies on work and the role of labor unions and other worker rights organizations in helping workers navigate changes in work caused by different technological changes. In different industries, that looks different. In manufacturing, we look at things like the impact of 3D printing and advanced robotics. In education, we're trying to understand how different applications and maybe even artificial intelligence technologies impact the teaching profession. Same in sports and entertainment and other unions. Each part of the economy has technologies that are always sort of driving forward, and we're helping workers and their unions really understand how to navigate and make sure that those technologies are working for working people.
Thank you for explaining that. Now, I know one thing that's been in the news a lot recently is ChatGPT, and I was wondering if you could discuss that and its role in labor. I know you just mentioned teachers, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ChatGPT is interesting, and I think I'm not sure that anybody really anticipated what a big splash it would have and how quickly the technology would roll out. And so, of course, it's all over the news, and there's a lot of fear and concern about it, a lot of effort to really understand what it is, what it does, and how it will impact work. What it is it's a large language model that is, surveying the internet and really sort of drawing all of from the information on the internet to produce quick, real-time answers that sort of synthesize information. And if you've explored it or tried it out, you'll see that you can ask it anything from like, write me a haiku about the labor movement to explain how these two political theorists would talk to each other about a particular topic. So it's a surprising technology to roll out and how quickly it can generate those answers. And I think that the impact that it'll have on different areas of work is really varied, and we're just learning it. And, I was talking to some colleagues in the startup space recently and saying, like, what we're seeing right now is an experiment in real time of how this technology will impact different sectors. Most employers don't really understand what it is or how it works, how it might benefit or hurt their business. And employers are really sort of figuring those things out. I mean, with the exclusion of large tech firms, of course. But that's having an impact on real people and real people's lives, right? And it takes time for people to be able to navigate those changes and understand those shifts. I think from the labor movement's perspective, we are always looking at how we protect workers, how we help them train and upskill to be able to embrace and use new technologies. And so the adoption of technology is something we're really interested in helping working people understand how to use technology to make their jobs better and safer. But we are also very concerned about, technologies that cause sort of large scale disruption and layoffs and really big fast shifts in industry. And that's how we're looking at ChatGPT. It's both things. How can we help workers figure out how to integrate it into their work in a way that makes sense? How do we make sure that as employers are trying to figure out how to use generative artificial intelligence technologies in the workplace, we're not having just massive impacts on jobs? And so that's what I think in a general way I would say about it. I do think in education it's interesting, right? Because both teachers are figuring out how they can use it, but they're also experiencing students trying to figure out how to use it. And, there have been concerns about plagiarism. There have been concerns about sort of copying and cheating, and how do you actually sort of guarantee that someone's work is actually their work? I think that as we see the technology be adopted in real time, what you'll see is it being starting to be used as a tool, like Wikipedia, or like Cliff's Notes, frankly, that can be like on more varied topics, but it will challenge students, I think, to work harder and develop their ideas further, right? I mean, that's the hope. But I think in the meantime, we really have to pay attention to the human impact of these technologies. And it does take time to figure out how they work and how they will change the way we do our work, and making sure what we call it a just transition exists for working people, where if their job is de-skilled, or if they lose their job because of an automation technology like generative AI, that we have pathways both through unions and collective bargaining, but also through public policy to help them train, upskill, and find new jobs of similar quality, in the place where they live.
Yeah, and you mentioned the human impact of technology. So I was wondering if you could discuss the role of technology in labor negotiations.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that's so interesting about the labor movement. We have a process called collective bargaining that works differently in different sectors, but in general, what it does is create worker voice for wages, hours, working conditions, and it creates a more democratic workplace. So unions have been negotiating and bargaining over the impact of technology for 120 years in the United States. President Schuler, who's the president of the AFL-CIO, often talks about how the IBEW, which is the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, really sort of tamed electricity. And when electricity was a new technology, it was wild, it was dangerous, it was unregulated. And you can see pictures of 100 electrical wires going into one building, and you think, oh my God, that is going to start on fire. And it did. And a lot of people were hurt, and inequities were caused. But it was really the IBEW both helping workers with on-site safety, but also really advocating for workplace regulations. That union played an enormous role in turning electricity into an everyday technology that's safe to use, that's well regulated. And it's same in the auto industry. When you think about the ways that cars have developed and changed over time, really unions have played an important role in helping figure out how to make those technologies easier and faster to make. But it all, I think, comes down to this process of bargaining and making sure that workers' rights, interests, and safety are represented at the bargaining table. I think often in our society, in the way that our labor law works, we end up bargaining over the effects of technology, because technology really doesn't, it impacts, what would I say? I would say since World War II, there's been this massive public investment in creating research and development streams that lead to the types of technologies we have now, from the iPhone to the computer to internet. And workers have not been a part of that. That's been public investment in universities and firms and a partnership to do basic and advanced research. And we at the Technology Institute are looking for ways to bring workers into that research and development structure. So instead of experiencing technology as it's sort of commercialized and sort of just comes into your workplace, that we actually think that workers have a role, not just in the workplace in adopting technology through bargaining processes, but also in the research and design of that technology, right? And so we think about both things. How do we use our contract negotiation process to make sure that workers are trained and upskilled and protected as new technologies are introduced? But also, how can we bring workers and their knowledge and expertise into the research and development process to improve technology and make sure that it's human-centered technology?
And yeah, thanks for explaining that. And I think one thing that's related is, labor laws and related laws. I know the Technology Institute has said that our laws haven't caught up to the technology yet. And I was wondering if you could talk about that. How behind are, our laws, our federal laws, or even state and local laws behind the technology that's being generated every day?
Well, I think there are two ways to answer that question. The first, if you think about labor law, particularly labor law is a specific body of law in our country that governs how unions and employers interact. And it is the case that over the past 40 years, labor law has been really narrowed in a way that makes it very, very difficult for workers in the private sector to organize. And what that means is that, organizing and getting a contract creates it creates a conversation and a set of rights for workers in their workplace that gives workers an amount of power in saying, what their wages and hours and working conditions should be, but also how the job should be done. We believe in the labor movement that workers are as expert in how to do their jobs as any engineer who's designing technology for a workplace. And that's because it's workers who at the end of the day are using the technology. They're the end user, so they know what works, what doesn't work, where they have to troubleshoot technologies. So I think that when we talk about emergent technologies and how weak private sector labor law is in this country, that should concern all of us. Because unions are a core way, like I said before when I was describing the IBEW's relationship to electrification at the beginning of the 20th century. So we really all as a society need to be focused on making labor law better in this country so that workers have more power to bargain and negotiate. That will make technology adoption better for everyone. It'll make our society more equitable, less polarized. When it comes to laws and regulations that are governing technologies like artificial intelligence or machine learning or other types of digital technologies, it isn't necessarily that we don't have frameworks for governing those types of technologies and how they interact with people and people's rights, but it is that these technologies are different and they cross-cut different areas of law, and that we don't yet have adequate enforcement systems. So I do think it's the case that we urgently need new legislation and regulation that is looking at aspects of how artificial intelligence, machine learning, those types of technologies impact work, impact democratic processes, impact consumer rights, privacy, surveillance, policing, all of these things that are just really core to our fundamental civil and human rights in the United States and globally. But it's also the case that, well, first of all, whatever we do in the United States around these technologies will impact the rest of the world. So I think there's a global interest in that. But also, I think it's the case that as we're thinking of how to actually govern these technologies, really being serious about how to enforce that governance. Because these technologies are adapting and changing over time. They're coming out with new capabilities that are surprising even to the developers who are creating them. And it's urgent, I think, that we're thinking not only about what are the right frameworks for regulating, the rights-based frameworks for regulating these technologies, but also how do we make sure that our government can enforce those rights and sort of comprehend and represent the rights of regular people. A lot of these technologies are really complicated. A lot of them are really protected by intellectual property law. And if we can't tell what is in an algorithm, how it's functioning, it's really hard to tell whether it's biased, whether it's sort of creating negative outcomes, right? And so it's, I think there's a lot of effort right now to really start to think through that in the United States. And I think that it's pretty urgent that we move that conversation forward soon.
Thank you. And I know the Technology Institute is concerned about how companies are hiding behind technology in some ways to exploit workers. But I was also wondering if you can discuss, so this is kind of a two-part question, if you can discuss how workers are leveraging technology to their advantage. For example, we heard so much about the Great Resignation about a year ago, and how even workers who maybe did not resign demanded that they be allowed to have more flexibility. So whether that was working remotely all the time, part of the time, or whatever arrangement they came to, and how this was especially important to caregivers, to parents who need that flexibility to be more present for their children or other family members. So I was wondering if you can discuss that. So both, how are companies hiding behind technology to exploit workers, and how have workers leveraged technology to demand more flexibility?
It's a great question. And I like the sort of like two approaches to it. I'll start by saying that given the massive amount of public investment that's gone into like creating these technologies, workers who pay taxes, who then are funding that research and have for the past, 50 years, should expect some return on their investment. And we think of that in terms of equity. So when we have new technologies introduced, it should also create better working conditions, more money, safer working conditions for workers. They should also benefit in very clear and tangible ways. The concept of flexibility is so interesting. And it's so interesting because of the way that technology is enabling us to have really different social relations around work, around family, around kind of where we live. And I think you're right. I think that platform-based companies, we can say sort of in the transportation and delivery space, for example, are sort of really advertising the jobs in those sectors as flexible. And they're saying they're flexible because this app gives people the ability to be independent contractors and set their own hours and conditions. It's questionable whether they actually are allowing workers to set their own hours and conditions. And I think there's a lot of evidence that some of those companies, some of those jobs are really bad jobs and exploitive jobs. It's also just not true that you can't use technology to make that kind of flexibility available to W-2 employees who have regular jobs and are covered by labor and employment law in the United States. So it's sort of like this bait and switch where they say, hey, if you want a flexible job, be an independent contractor on this app and don't have any rights, when in fact, any employer can use a platform technology to create flexibility in scheduling and self-scheduling for workers and other things that apps and platforms can provide while still providing W-2 employment situation, which is what gives you worker rights in this country. And so I think that's an interesting conversation to have. And I think at the end of the day, we just need to be talking about what are our real values? Like, don't we want to take care of workers? And shouldn't we be using technology to make work better, easier, faster, safer for everybody? There are different kinds of efficiencies that businesses can find rather than just sort of exploiting workers by using technology. And that's what we're interested in this space.
Thank you for discussing that. And I was also hoping you could discuss kind of how exploitation might look different depending on the quote unquote class of worker. So for those who have jobs where technology plays a huge role, we're hearing more about how these workers are kind of expected to be on call all the time. So their working hours are not clearly defined. They're answering emails at all hours of the night or expected to, just be available 24/7. So can you talk about how exploitation might look different depending on the class of worker, I guess?
Yeah, another great question, really. And I think that especially if you look at jobs in big tech, there's a lot of hype about how much those jobs pay and the sort of like fringy benefits that come along with them. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of those jobs are really brutal and as exploitive as low wage work. The question of what workers need and want out of any job, it does animate how unions interact with workers and what they bargain for in those sectors. So, in high wage tech jobs that are abusive, it may not be that people are bargaining over salary, although I think gender and racial equity in those jobs is a big, like how do you have transparency so you can have equitable salaries? That's a big concern of workers in those sectors. But hours and expectations around, time off and unscheduled work is a huge, it's job quality. I mean, it all comes down to job quality. I also think workers in tech are thinking of interesting ways that they can use collective bargaining to advance other concerns about like the social impacts of the technologies that they're creating. So in sort of big tech worker organizing, there's a lot of really interesting work in collaboration that workers are doing to really try and shape that industry to make it more humane, both for the workers in the industry, but also for the impacts of those technologies on our society. So it's a really interesting space to watch.
Yeah, and you mentioned salary briefly. And now, one thing I've heard when I was asking earlier about flexibility, one thing I've heard about that is some companies have said, okay, you can work home 3 days a week, but or even 5 days a week, but we will dock your salary by 25% or 30% because now you no longer have to commute. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, companies that want to dock the salaries of remote workers.
I think that's a terrible idea. Companies do a lot of things to save money on their employees, and it's too bad that the way that companies look as employees are sort of liabilities on the balance sheet. Again, like I would just say that there are many, many ways that employers can use technologies to find efficiencies by helping workers have more flexibility and have sort of better and safer jobs. And that creates a better work environment when workers are happy and they feel respected and they have a voice on the job. That's what creates a really sort of durable, deeply engaged workforce. And efforts to sort of nickel and dime workers around flexibility, I think miss a bigger point, which is some people work better from home and have more flexibility. And in an industry where that kind of choice is available, workers should be bargaining to sort of protect their rights, and workers should be sort of collaborating with their employees to find out where their employers to find out where those other efficiencies can be.
And then, just going back to labor negotiations and the labor movement more generally, I'm based in California. Right now, the writers are on strike in Los Angeles, the teachers are on strike in Oakland. And I was wondering, what you think about how technology is being used in strikes, whether that's social media hashtags or people posting pictures and videos. How is technology helping striking workers get their message across?
The labor movement and the right to form, join, and organize a union in this country is a really, really powerful tool that regular people have to exert more control over their lives and to make their lives better. But I think for the past 30 or 40, 50 years, labor unions have really been under assault, both in terms of labor law, like I talked about earlier, but also the public narrative about unions is really off base and really, I think, driven by PR firms that make a lot of money by pushing anti-union rhetoric. Employers don't want unions because unions are powerful. One of the things that is so cool about the last few years and the sort of emergence of really powerful worker rights organizing and union organizing and the display of that on social media is that it's telling a really different story about what the labor movement is. And it explains, what a strike is to people who probably feel like they also wish they had a union and could go on strike. And it, I think, is like inspirational to the whole society in a way that we haven't really been able to see, like workers standing up in real time talking about these issues directly through social media. So that is like a very cool trend. I also think that when workers go on strike, often, the media, the story quickly turns to how annoying it might be to have a strike or how disruptive it is to industry. And that's not a dynamic that creates solidarity in a society, right? And so I think workers being able to tell their own stories and generate support kind of requires the media to tell a different story about strikes. And that's fair. And that we want to see more of that. I also just think that over social media in the past few years, we've seen so much actual workers organizing each other, workers with different types of workplaces, workers who are, in different parts of the country. And it's very, very cool to see that kind of like DIY get on social media and kind of build a movement.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you about, even though I'm a member of the media, about the media portrayal of strikes, because right now with the writer strike, for example, the narrative has been, oh, you may not be able to see your favorite TV shows anymore. And when the teachers are on a strike, the narrative is usually how it's going to inconvenience parents and not necessarily what the workers are striking for. And just switching gears a little bit, I was wondering if you could also discuss some of the partnerships the Technology Institute has. I know you have some partnerships with different academic institutions like Carnegie Mellon, and I was just wondering if you could talk about that and, the work you all might be doing in the future.
Yeah, well, another good question. So many good questions in this interview. In the beginning of this interview, I sort of talked about how we really believe that right now we're in a situation where technology sort of happens to workers, and then we figure out how to bargain over the effects. Part of why we created the Technology Institute was to bring workers into the lab and to have them be co-collaborators in developing technology. There are a couple things that come from this. The first one is better technology. Again, because workers at the end of the day are the end users of most technology. They understand more than anyone else how work in their industry gets done, and they can provide just incredible insights to researchers who otherwise don't have that knowledge. And so really valuing the knowledge. I mean, you're a media practitioner, you know so many things about how to do your job that you couldn't tell if you were an engineer in a lab trying to think about how to build a news app, right? And same for someone who's an Uber or Lyft driver, or same for someone who's a teacher, right? You just know so much because you've done the job. And so that's part of just a belief that technology will be bettered and it will be more human-centered if workers are involved in shaping it. But the other thing that comes out of this partnership, particularly with Carnegie Mellon University, is that there's more transparency into understanding how technology will impact work. So for labor unions, seeing 5, 10, 15 years into the future of a technology helps us understand what to bargain over, how to train our workers, how to help them prepare for the future. It also can help employers or governments understand how to think about developing their workforce. So it takes some of the mysticism out of technology. So when we think about things like automated vehicles or 3D printing, those technologies will be developed, they'll be deployed. The question is, how will they be adopted and how will society react? And these partnerships that we have with universities around research and design really kind of help us build a better picture of how to advocate and protect workers as tech changes.
Yeah. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with the 19th. We really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.